Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started if everybody's okay with that. Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here tonight for our alternate currents panel discussion from the margins to the center, inclusive curatorial practices with Natalie Bell, Mary Lawson, Jared Ledesma, and our moderator, Jared Packard. We've got two Jareds tonight. Special thanks to the Pate Family Foundation, the Nebraska Arts Council, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment for making virtual programs like this possible. My name is Peter. I'm the program director at Amplify Arts. If anybody's new to Amplify, our mission is to promote unity, progress, and innovation in the cultural sector. And alternate currents is one program that helps us do that by contextualizing big national and international issues in the arts with responses from people working on the ground. So the program itself is comprised of a blog, a bi-monthly discussion series, and an artist working group of 10 artists, organizers, culture workers who help us kind of shape the program and determine the direction that it moves. Jared Packard is a member of our 2021 Alternate Currents Working Group. And this discussion tonight is just one in a year-long investigation of the future of our cultural institutions. We're interested in talking with people about how those institutions can become more equitable, more transparent, and more just. So if you're interested in more discussions and conversations like this, please visit the Alternate Currents blog. You can go to amplifyarts.org/alternate currents anytime and watch videos, listen to interviews, and read posts from people like the amazing group of panelists that we have here tonight. So with all of that said, I'm super excited for this discussion and to hear from Natalie, Mary, Jared, and Jared. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jared Packard.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for bringing this wonderful cast of characters together. I too am very excited to tease out some conversation tonight. I'm Jared Packard. I am an artist and a curator based in Omaha. I'm an exhibitions manager at the Bemis Center, so that's kind of my vantage point in this conversation. But I'll let each of the three of you introduce yourselves. If you could give a little bit of background and maybe say something about what inclusive curating means to you, and maybe speak a little bit to your experience in cultural institutions, and to kind of give everyone a vision of, your vantage point in this conversation. Mary, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Jared. And thank you for holding space for this conversation, and thank you, Amplify, for making space. My name is Mary Lawson. I am a Black femme woman. I identify as a Midwesterner, lived in Utah, Colorado, and most recently Nebraska. I just moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and work at Charlotte Street Foundation as their grants and awards programs manager. I am an artist organizer, and I don't necessarily call myself a curator, but have had the honor and privilege of curating shows, DIY style, and within the last 3 years in established institutions, nonprofits specifically. Inclusive curating, is that the question, Jared? Mm-hmm. Hearing that question, my response to that question is questions. What questions do the artists want to ask spaces? What questions do they want to ask audiences that are viewing their work? And what questions are created from the works in the spaces? So I think that that's what inclusive curating means to me. It's just like this creation of more questions about powers at play, the institutions themselves, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mary. Natalie, would you like to go?
Sure, thanks. My name's Natalie Bell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman who is a curator based in Boston. I work at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, which is in Cambridge. And it is a university contemporary art gallery that puts on contemporary art exhibitions that are rotating, usually around 3 per year. And I also oversee a public art collection and public art commissions on MIT's campus. And prior to that, I was working at the New Museum in New York City, also working with mostly living artists and making temporary exhibitions of contemporary art. That was an institution that did not have a permanent collection. So most of the work, really almost all of it, was temporary exhibitions, loaned works, new commissions, project works with artists. And for me, inclusive curating, I think there's a lot of different angles that you can approach it. But at its base, I think it's really about thinking about who is centered in the work that you do, and who is welcome in the the spaces and exhibitions that you organize. And with that, I'll pass it to Jared.
Thank you. So I am Jared Ledesma. My pronouns are he, him, his. And I am currently in Akron, Ohio. I'm originally from Union City in California. It's a suburb of the San Francisco Bay Area. Born and raised, moved out, worked for a while at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and then moved out to Des Moines, Iowa, where I worked at the Des Moines Art Center, which is a modern and contemporary art museum, and was there for about 4.5 years. And I'm now 3 weeks in Akron, Ohio, working at the Akron Art Museum as our senior curator, which is also a modern and contemporary art museum. We have about 7,000 objects in our collection. Our collection starts around 1850 to the present day, and actually next year is our 100th anniversary. So we've been around in Akron, Ohio for quite some time. Inclusive curating, I think for me personally, my background, how I came to art history, has always been, at least in my experience, a little different than others. I grew up, my single mother raised me. My family, they didn't go to college. My parents didn't graduate from college. I didn't grow up around an art collection. I came to art rather late in my childhood. And so I always think about like my mom when I'm curating, or people in the community where I grew up. Union City is extremely diverse. It's there are a lot of Pakistani, largely Latinx, and Black, and so I come to curating thinking about communities where art is where art is difficult to understand, especially modern and contemporary art, where it's intimidating. I remember, my first weeks in graduate school reading Foucault to my mom, because I attended a commuter school. So I would commute, I lived at home and would commute to grad school and come back home and read Foucault to my mom. And she'd be like, "What does that mean?" And I'd be like, "I don't know." And so that's always in the back of my head, like really trying to relate art and contemporary art to audiences who are intimidated by it, and also seeing people like me, gay Latinx person, on the walls. I think that's also important as well.
Thank you all. Now I'm just even more excited for this conversation. As we were kind of prepping for this, I was thinking about how I was taught curating, both by example and explicitly in the classroom. And I really understood it, or was told that it was like a curator was someone who had this like genius idea and then assembled like artists around that idea, right? Which kind of connotes using artists as a stepping stone in their career in some way. And so I don't know, that's kind of where I was coming from entering this conversation. I'm really interested to see how we can expand and explode that. Peter offered us a useful lens in thinking about the Latin root of the word to curate as to care for. And I think that historically that's meant to care for objects. And as we're thinking about how we can expand that, I'm interested to hear you talk about like how you think about caring when you're entering curating an exhibition or a public program or an event.
I can dive into that. This is like, I think one of the really frequent touch points in curatorial conversations. It's one that we're all familiar with. And yeah, as you said, it is, I think, coming out of a tradition of caring for a collection, of looking after physical objects. But, for those of us who are working with living artists, it's a very different relationship. And I think that on the one hand, it can be very, very personal, or it can also be, kind of forward thinking and having a care for an artist's future legacy, and wanting to be able to make sure that you're offering some kind of contribution toward that. And yeah, I think, one other way that I think about care when I'm programming is, in a different direction, which is, why should other people care about this? And I think that ties a little bit to what you were touching on, Jared, about thinking of your mom. For me, I think of my family members too. And, especially writing texts about art or texts for exhibition spaces. For some of us who've gone into academic spaces where like you get sort of drenched in jargon, you have to then also come out and like let that dry off and come back to speaking in like a clear and simple way about what it is that you're sharing with people. And so, one way of thinking about care is why should others care about this, and why do you care about it? And that, I think, can be a really simple but powerful test for thinking about, why do you want to present something? Why does it matter? Why do you yourself as the curator or organizer care about this? And why do you want other people to care about it? Because I think, part of that is about really just bringing people in, and making sure that what you're doing has value to the people that you're sharing it with.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting what you said about the personal side of it. I definitely bring that to my work. Feminist, interested in queer art, and I remember like studying queer art in the early 2000s, and people were like, "What's that?" Or like, "What's queer theory?" It was still relatively new, and even like, yeah, what is queer art? I was at one point, I was even, I wouldn't say embarrassed, but compared to someone who studies early 20th century Matisse, as far as being marketable for jobs and so on, it was really interesting for me. And now, Akron, I was very honest about who I am and my interest, and that museums are not neutral, that I am an uber feminist, and they loved all that. And but I feel like a few years ago I couldn't be that honest, or maybe with certain institutions I can't be that honest. I'm not quite sure, but so what you're saying about, Natalie, about the personal, I think is really interesting, and caring about the decisions I make, and the artists that I choose. But yeah, also about the communities. In Des Moines, it was really interesting where there are areas of Des Moines where people don't even know what the Des Moines Art Center is. They didn't know we were free, or they would say, "Oh, that's not for me. That's not for me." And that was, it's hard to access those areas, and it's a long uphill battle to try to. I mean, there were bus lines that didn't even go near the art center. the art center is in one of the most wealthiest areas of the city, and so on. So, but the communities like that, I really want them to see themselves at the museum. When I got to Des Moines, I made it very clear. I went around and I met people in LGBTQ organizations, and I just wanted them to know there's a gay curator in town. You know, I'm there for you. I am, you know, I will curate shows for you. I want to be the access to the art center's collection that is queer. We have queer art. I'm going to bring it out for you. Like, come, you know, and that was really important for me as well.
These are really beautiful answers. I think the only thing that I would add to what Natalie and Jared have shared so far is just what I've heard in the last couple of years from my mentor and co-collaborators and co-organizers, which is what does, you know, a spirit of care look like in this work that we do? And how can we create a culture of care? So not only caring for objects and materials that the artists that we're working with bring in, but also just like what is a spirit of care, and how can we create a culture of care in these spaces that we're holding for artists and communities, and just to uplift what Jared just shared about Black and Brown communities not having access to these spaces that we are sharing artists and artist works. And I think, you know, that's definitely like a historical thing. I'm losing track of my thoughts, but that's just what it is. I think that contemporary art and art period has not been accessible in Black and Brown communities. So, you know, we aren't as familiar with what it is. And so there isn't value to it, if that makes sense. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, Jared, you're talking about intentional outreach and relationship building. And I'm curious how, one, I want to kind of offer that's a similar question, or how that something similar might play a role in Mary and Natalie's practices. But I'm also interested in how that kind of engagement might expand kind of the limitations of your like a more traditional, for whatever that's worth, kind of curatorial practice. And what opportunities in your experience has that opened up, and what lessons have you learned from that?
I'll start. I don't have a traditional background. I studied vocal performance in college when I was in college before I dropped out, and also studied cultural studies. And so me stepping into any type of curatorial practice was just because I wanted to be around my friends and their work. And so that's my background. I feel like now that I'm in this more, I guess, professional way of doing things, and working at a nonprofit institution here in Kansas City, I think what I bring to the table that is new and refreshing and will challenge these spaces is that I don't have a traditional background, and I'm interested in challenging these spaces at all points, strategically. I don't even know what your question was, Jared. Sorry.
Yeah, I was also going to ask you to restate it.
Totally. I guess I'm interested in kind of what are the limitations of curatorial expertise as we know it, and what have you gained through kind of these going outside the institution or outreach and community engagement? How has that challenge kind of your own curatorial practice? What have you learned that's maybe outside of conventions?
I have a really great story that I can share that's related to that. So I organized a show at the Des Moines Art Center called Queer Abstraction. It was pretty major for Des Moines and for the Art Center. And one of the amazing ideas that our director of education shared with me is that we should get a group of community leaders together, and you could share the idea of the exhibition and see what they think and kind of walk them through the exhibition space. And it was more like we're doing this show, we would like we would like your input. So I met with community leaders from One Iowa, from Iowa Safe Schools as well. These are LGBTQ organizations in Iowa. And, I pitched the idea of the show and the thesis, and then we were kind of walking through the Art Center's main gallery space where the show would be. And when I opened it up to questions, literally the first question that I got was, how many artists of color and how many artists are bisexual? And I hadn't prepared to give an answer like that, because there were few artists of color and there were no artists that were bisexual, at least to my knowledge. And so it really took me back, and I fumbled, and it was a learning experience that I had to prepare an answer for questions like that it was reality that people are now looking at statistics as far as exhibitions and numbers, and not like, people who write reviews for Art in America, but like people in my community are looking at this, and it's important. And so luckily that gathering was so far in advance of the exhibition that I was able to add more artists to the show and really think about inclusivity in that way. And I don't know, if I hadn't gotten that question, I don't know what queer abstraction would have looked like, if it would have looked different or not.
I'll share a little personal experience that kind of cuts both ways on this issue. What I'm thinking of is a large group exhibition that I was involved in pretty closely when I began working at the New Museum in 2013. And it was a group show that was taking up the subject of contemporary art from the Arab world. And it was a curatorial team of primarily white American and European curators. And in order to research the exhibition, we did a lot of outreach to speak with people, to meet with artists, to learn about the various art scenes in countries throughout the Arab world or Middle East and North Africa. And what my point is here, this show was very complicated to put together, and I think was in some ways like out of tune with its moment, but also necessary. And I think also probably maybe one of the last of its kind in terms of museums doing geographically or culturally defined group shows, just like, and then kind of finding some sub-theme within that. I don't see that happening anymore, and I think that's a good thing. However, at the time, the argument to do the show was that there was an absence of representation of Arab artists in museums in New York City, and that was true. And it's still true, and it's true throughout the United States. So, the argument was, this is a way to kind of make a big introduction. No other museums are doing it for reasons that are maybe more complex than the scope of this conversation. and therefore we should do it. And the argument for not engaging curators who are from an Arab background or from the Middle East was because they would already have too much expertise, or in other words, a certain kind of bias, or they were too close to that scene to be able to take a kind of fresh look at it. So that's a different angle on it. I'm not saying that I completely agree with that. I think there's probably a balance that could be struck and would potentially make for a richer show. And there were ways that we did engage, I would say, certain cultural groups or creatives from Arab backgrounds. We worked with Badoon magazine to produce the catalog for the show. And really we're getting, all kinds of feedback throughout the process, some of it solicited and some of it not solicited. But, what I wanted to raise here is the notion that, sometimes you can be too close to something to be able to have perspective. And how do we balance the benefit that can come from being new to a subject or to a kind of cultural experience, and then what's at stake when you are new? What is lost from a novice's entry? Obviously, no one, including myself, who was involved in making that show, wanted to be a novice in that. We did everything that we could to make sure that we were well read and well informed, but we don't have those lived experiences and didn't. So, for us to be engaging with work that was about the Lebanese Civil War or, the Israeli occupation of Palestine is ultimately going to be coming from a position of not knowing that through one's own lived experience. Anyway, that's a long kind of personal experience that I wanted to share, but that's one that came to mind because part of me still does think that there can be value in having distance to allow perspective on something. At the same time, it can be super problematic. And that was an exhibition that I think had some of both. And I think there's lots of people who have other opinions about that show too. And many of them have already written about it in various journals.
Yeah, that to me is really interesting in terms of acknowledging the limitations of your own capacity and maybe the presumed authority of a curator. And maybe just to throw that thought at Jared and Mary before moving on, because I'm wondering if either of you have anything that you want to riff on that.
I wanted to add this because I feel like my thoughts are all over the place. But the first question that we answered at the top of this conversation about inclusivity. So I recently took this course online called Decolonizing Curatorial and Artistic Practices. And the first session that we had, we watched this video about, it was a short film, and something that was said in that film will stay with me forever, which is about the term inclusivity and how when we use it in this context, we usually are meaning that some groups of people are superior to a space. And I only bring that up to say, I feel like when we're thinking about care, a spirit of care, culture of care in these spaces, what does decolonized practice look like, not only for the artist, but also for the curator, for others on staff. And also, when I was working at the Union in Omaha and now here in Kansas City, something else that's floated up at both organizations is anti-oppression. So what does that also look like in these spaces? And And so, yeah, I wanted to say that, and also mention that as a Black femme woman, I'm very interested in sharing space with my people and with Indigenous people and with Brown people. And I think that when we are in these spaces that have historically not been open to us or accessible to us, it's revolutionary. And I think that when we are visible in these spaces, a lot of transformation can happen. Of course, like so many things have to be in order for all of that change to happen. But I think also just occupying these spaces and sharing space is one way of doing that.
Yeah, I'm I'm thinking also in the wake of George Floyd's murder and all of the statements being put out by cultural institutions paired with COVID, there's been a call for cultural institutions to do better. And we've watched some take steps forward and many recede into the status quo. And I'm curious to what do you think inclusive curatorial practices might do for cultural institutions to be more racially equitable?
I'll jump in. I think I don't know. Demystifying the museum, I think is key. I think realizing that the museum is an artifact of colonialism, and I know like that's something that's being thrown around, but I think it's really hard for certain institutions to understand that or to accept that. And it's incredibly hard for a modern and contemporary art museum to stop in its tracks and realize that and make change. It's like I was saying earlier, it's going to take years. Everything from the wall text to staffing, to how you post a job, where you post a job. But I think that's a first step. Yeah, I think that's all I have right now. I'll think more about it.
Yeah, I want to follow what you said about it being especially hard for contemporary and modern museums, and that's something I've felt a lot. And I'll say too that I'm still learning this. I'm still unlearning, and one thing I've observed is that it's one thing to be able to look at encyclopedic museums like the Met or the MFA in Boston and say, oh, well, yeah, like they're artifacts of colonialism because they have all these old objects that were stolen from colonial countries. And it's much harder to look at a contemporary art museum and see how that too is still an artifact of colonialism. That is really hard to do. It takes a lot more introspection, and I think it takes a lot more sort of translation of practices and understanding how certain conventions do effectively a similar thing. And to use the example of the show I was just talking about, like that is absolutely a show that was in a colonial framework. And I think that's like basically one of the biggest problems with it. Certain other practices that come to mind, or even just the sort of ethos of discovery and newness that is so central to showing contemporary art, and the emphasis on someone's first show or their first show in the US or their first something and the expectation that as the curator, you're kind of a talent scout and you're just like roaming the world and picking up the next new artist from a foreign country to bring to their first US solo, so that you can put on the wall text that it's their first US solo and you discovered them. That's colonial. So, you know, there's much more too, but that's just to name like one very common convention that like we could definitely live without.
Thank you for naming that, because it is, to your point, it is hard to kind of understand how those conventions operate in a contemporary context. And it is kind of easy to be like, well, we work with contemporary artists or living artists, and therefore we're absolved of the responsibilities that come tied to, that come with like a collecting institution and that history of violence. I feel like there's been a few times where we've named or identified some of like the barriers to these institutions. I thought it was really interesting, Jared, your point about how like the bus lines didn't even go to the Des Moines Arts Center, right? And I'm curious, what are some of the other barriers that are preventing people and communities from being more engaged with cultural institutions?
I think, you know, walking into a space and was there another part of the question, Jared? Oh no, okay. I think that walking into a space and not seeing someone that looks like you, I think that's a very obvious like barrier. Not being familiar with a space or what value it holds, and yeah, I think those are a couple of barriers that come to mind.
I think also the cost of entry. I mean, that was an issue for me for many years, until I was working in the field and could show an employee ID card and most of the time get a kind of a comped entry. But museums are super expensive. You know, $25 is, for most people, they'd rather spend that on a movie.
Yeah, I agree. I think I used to get really mad when people would be like, you know, museums are so expensive, and I'd be like, well, you go to football games, like that's expensive to me. And but no, now they are expensive, and that is a barrier, because culture is especially the visual arts, I think, is viewed different. That should be free. That as opposed to that's an interesting conversation that I think we could spend a while talking about. But I think Mary talking about value and the institution, I think, is really interesting. It was like that at the Art Center, and then now at Akron, where we have these amazing collections of modern and contemporary art, and like right in people's backyards, and they don't understand like the value or what they can gain, the perspective from these artists, and that's really challenging for me. And I think, you know, a lot of times I would wander in the galleries in the Art Center to take breaks, and often I would hear people ask the guards, are these the real things or are these replicas? You know, it was hard for them to believe that Des Moines has a Picasso or a Matisse. And yeah, I think that was interesting as well. I think, and then another barrier that I mentioned earlier is staff. And like you're saying, Mary, about, you know, do I see myself in the museum and staffing and making sure that there's diversity among staff, I think, is key.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Jared, I was going to put this in the chat box, but when you do see someone that looks like you, a person of color in these spaces, what roles do they play, you know? Same thing.
How as we're thinking about kind of these more inclusive ways to approach exhibition making or public programming, what are, I guess, I don't know, to project a little into the future, how do you see kind of the role or the obligations of the curator shifting in the coming years?
Algorithms. That's a joke.
Can you say more about that? I don't know what that means.
It's not a joke. It's a joke. It's a bad joke that like curatorial work will be replaced by algorithms. It's super possible and around the corner. You know, I think another possibility is that curatorial work will be less about the individual curator, that is, and more work that is done through a committee or a coalition. And yeah, that the role will kind of evolve more into one of an organizer, a project manager, you know, something that is maybe less driven by individual taste, or you know, a certain expertise, if we're going to invest in that as a notion.
Yeah, I agree about the role of the curator changing to more community driven. The Promise Witness Remembrance show at the Speed Art Museum, I was lucky enough to see that, and I think it was Allison Glenn, okay, thanks, who curated that exhibition. And I think there are many aspects of that show that I thought was really incredible, but one thing that I really admired was that Breonna Taylor's mother wrote her timeline, her chronology. I think for a curator to give up wall text space to someone, like I think it sounds trite, or but I think that's a big deal, to give responsibility for the wall text on the walls to someone who's not a curator or not trained as an art historian. I think that's radical in some ways, and I loved it. And I think definitely, and I embrace that. And I hope to see more of that in curation, a collaboration with community and with artists writing labels. We have a Donald Judd in the Akron Art Museum's collection, and I was just told a story last week about years ago, someone got really excited, a visitor got really excited about the work, who was only at the museum to see our Norman Rockwell exhibition, but this is the first time they saw our Donald Judd, and it was a sculpture that sits on the floor, and they were telling their spouse or partner that they got really excited because of the execution of the work. This person is a metal worker, and they saw the simplicity, but also the perfectionism in the execution of the design. And that's something that I would never think about. I did not think about that before hearing this story. And so right away I'm like, oh my God, this person should give a tour, or like they should write the label at least, or like really like inviting them to give that perspective and insight, I think is also a part of the future of curating.
I just want to open up the floor to questions from anyone in the audience. Please feel free to chat them in. Oh, there's already one in here. I just missed it. How can artists, parents, and other community members, etc., help instill the value of public arts and art spaces into our communities?
I think getting involved in local policy making, figuring out, understanding who's running for what and what they stand for, and yeah, see what they're talking about when it comes to arts and culture in the cities and towns that you live in.
Yeah, I think, so much comes down to funding. And in the US, we don't have any great precedent of government or state funding really being able to sustain art centers. So much of our funding comes privately. And I think that, it's a circular issue because the problem, the lack of funding comes from a lack of valuing it. So how do you get people to value it? Well, we need to put more funding into it. But I think a lot of the way that a lot of people I know who come to art have come to it through a really great teacher, or a really great encounter with it through someone who we might call a really great interpreter. And those are these kind of people who can bring someone into it. And I would say, find those people and pay them and support them and help them do what they're doing.
On that issue of funding, recently in our last local election cycle here in Omaha, a cohort of cultural workers and activists, actually facilitated by Amplify Arts, so thank you, came together to create a voter's guide for the arts. And it was the first time I encounter them all the time for, this is how to vote Democrat, this is how to vote along these political lines. And I was kind of struck by like how obvious that was. And yet I have not encountered it yet. And it seems like a really direct way, because it is, yes, it's hard to know what all the representatives are doing for the arts community, and those issues aren't being foregrounded in like the broader political discourse on a national level or on a local level. And so those like small gestures of uplifting simple ways and like spotlighting that for folks like via a voter's guide felt like a really effective way to be engaged. I had a question as I was listening to the three of you talk, and it comes a little bit out of my experience with at the Bemis Center, where a lot of the exhibitions and programming that we do is bringing in national and international artists into Omaha. And I think in the call for institutions to do better, part of that has been to be more community centric, right? And I sometimes encounter navigating our little Omaha art world, kind of a frustration that like, well, Bemis Center doesn't show local artists, it doesn't show me, it doesn't show my friends, so why should I care? Right. And I find myself feeling very conflicted on that issue, because on one hand, like, yes, we can do better to connect the dots and to represent and activate our community. And on the other hand, I'm like, well, these are still great artists. And like, this is really exciting stuff. And like, you can learn something from them. And I want to share that excitement. And so I don't know, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how to negotiate kind of this like locality in kind of a broader global kind of art world.
That's hard. That's really hard. I got that in Des Moines, especially because at the Des Moines Arts Center, there's an annual exhibition called Iowa Artists, where they feature an Iowa artist every year. And for a while, I think it started in the 40s. It was like a juried art show. And then it changed to the curators would choose the artists. And so we would get inquiries or queries about why isn't it a juried show any longer? And also you have Art Center in your name. Why isn't it more like a community center? Why aren't you showing my work? And it's hard. I think those questions are hard to answer. And I think, I would always invite them to come to the museum and meet me, come see what's on our walls, and let me explain why these artists are important, why we're showing them. I would explain that, right now we're looking at women artists or artists of color, and this is something that's really important to us. Or, even we get people wanting to donate their artwork to the collection, and I would have to give the same response. And it's hard. And I think, in Des Moines especially, but also in Akron, we want to bring the contemporary art world to our communities and share what's out there for people who can't travel to New York City or to Los Angeles. And so that's part of it as well. But it's hard.
On a somewhat different scale, when I was at the New Museum, we very rarely showed artists from New York City. And there are more than a few artists in New York City who would be, in my mind, deserving of a New Museum exhibition. And it was just a strange thing that the emphasis had kind of become so much on, bringing in artists who'd never had a show in New York before, that it effectively eliminated artists who'd been living there, because if they're living there, they've probably had a show there, even at a gallery. And that's just a strange thing. And there were once in a while exceptions to that, but it's difficult. And I think it is sometimes, this isn't a great answer, but one answer is that it is sometimes just where an institution falls in a larger ecosystem of art spaces in a given place. So, if you have the Whitney or MoMA PS1 who are going to be showing more American artists or more local artists, add to that the Queens Museum, the Brooklyn Museum showing a lot of local artists, then the argument would go that it's fine to have a museum has its eyes a little bit more elsewhere in the world. And part of me agrees with that. And I think that's, just a sort of subtle unspoken negotiation that sometimes happens in, I would say in urban spaces that have enough of a, an arts ecosystem that such a thing could exist. But it's still, it's always a balancing act of some sort to collapse that into a bit of a cliche, but I think you know what I mean.
I think another part of that question, that this is like another criticism levied at me that I'm gonna throw at y'all, so sorry, is that and we haven't spent much time today thinking about public programming and using that as a band-aid on an amputated arm of here's our local flavor, you know what I mean? And I'm curious how public programming might play a part in kind of this more inclusive curatorial practice for you.
I think I'll jump in just for a little bit, going back to queer abstraction. When we decided to add that show to the exhibition schedule, the curatorial team at the Art Center, we thought it'd be a good idea to start bringing out the queerness of the collection in different ways. I did a show on Grant Wood and his sexuality. I started giving tours with the director of One Iowa, where we went around and looked at artworks either by queer artists or that were queer in some shape or form, just to help our audiences start thinking about queerness and even becoming familiar with the word queer, which was fairly new in Des Moines. Yeah.
The only thing that comes to mind is archive, like a counter archive being like my inspiration for public programming. Like how can I make this like impermanent thing have a little bit more longevity?
Mhm.
So I curated this year-long series at Charlotte Street Foundation before they hired me, called Because of This. And one of the public programming components of the series is this audio archive. And so throughout the series, we're interviewing all of the artists that are a part of the series, all of the performers, and not all of them, but a few of them. And so, yeah, that's what comes to mind, is archiving things and documenting.
Well, that takes us to the hour. So unless there's like any final thoughts that y'all want to share on this, or final questions from the audience, I'm just super grateful for your thoughtfulness and your generosity. I feel like this conversation, I'm taking away like maybe a new level of acknowledgement, or a different kind of acknowledgement of the limitations of kind of our knowing and the institutional knowing. And kind of maybe to return to kind of like at the onset thinking about caring, like how to better care for ourselves and for others, and about bodies and their politics in ways that extend conventional kind of curatorial practices. So thank you all for that.
My final thoughts are, one, Jared and Jared, we're all wearing the same color.
I know, yeah, I was gonna say that.
I just realized that. And the second thought is, I really love, Natalie, your point about perspective and being too close to something at some points, and not having a perspective that might offer like balance. So I'm gonna sit with that. And Jared, you shared many beautiful things as well. So thank you, Jared Packard, for moderating. This was great.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Natalie, your comment about finding the next, like being the first artist, or yeah, something that was awesome. And I was literally like, wow, like, oh shit. So thank you. That was,
I mean, it's depressing. I've done it so many times.
yeah, no, yeah, and it's something that I think I've been asked to do many times. You need to find the next emerging artist because we can't afford so and so. And
Right.
anyways,
And the number of times that you've said like, oh, they're like a young so and so.
right. Yep.
You know, you
Right.
just sort of slot them into place to ascend as, yeah.
So thank you both, Mary and Natalie, as well.
Yeah, thank you both. I feel like I've gotten a lot of food for thought, and you know, there's a lot of work to be done.
I love how mutually supportive you three are. So great. Keep it up. Well, thank you all. And for all of our guests out there, thank you. You have a great night. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.